My guest today is Dr. Stephen Rowley, who is a psychotherapist practicing in Washington. His past professional experience includes serving as a principal and a school district superintendent. He's been a college professor at 3 universities and received his PhD from Stanford University. In today's episode, we talk about his new book, The Lost Coin, a memoir of adoption and destiny. Welcome to Lifeology.
Thanks very much, James. Glad to be here.
I am looking forward to this. It's always great to talk to a fellow psychotherapist, but we are definitely going to showcase you and all your expertise, and I'm really looking forward to this. So how did you decide that you wanted to become a psychotherapist?
Well, I'm not sure it's in the introduction, I didn't become a psychotherapist until I was 68 years old. So I had a long career in
Oh,
education, both
oh,
K-12 and
okay.
higher ed. It actually was over lunch when I was bemoaning the fact that I was too old to become a psychotherapist. I had a friend say, "Well, what's keeping you anyway?" I couldn't answer that. So, but
Hmm.
I would call it a dream deferred. I started reading Freud and other analysts, and also including Jung when I was very young, and also
Mm-hmm.
those sort of parallel interests in mythology. Very influenced by Joseph Campbell, but
Mm-hmm.
also later James Hillman, James Hollis. So those people were running those ideas were running parallel with the rest of my career. But when I was sort of tired of doing what I was doing in an online university, I just jumped at the chance. So once I got to Pacifica, even though I was much older than even many of the instructors and professors, it really felt like home, and I kind of
Yeah.
launched from there. I think in terms of my own. It's in the book. It's even a my own sort of avenues of different kind of learning that I took on my own. So,
Hmm.
that started and it's still going.
That's amazing. Now we'll get to your personal backstory as far as the being adopted, et cetera, in just a second. But to what drew you to education then, if you did it for so long?
Pardon me?
What drew you to education? So you're working as a teacher, as a
Oh,
superintendent, as a principal?
where did I get my education?
No, what drew you to become an educator?
Oh, I think, spun out of the 60s, spun out of the radical days at University of Wisconsin,
Mm-hmm.
1967, 71. Tanks, bayonets, tear gas. There was a killing from a
Oh,
bombing. And I
oh
decided at
wow.
some point, in terms of contributing, rather than just being protesting all the time, I felt so strongly about contributing in some way. Plus, I was really influenced by a book called Somerville by A.S. Neal, a
Hmm.
different way of learning, a different kind of schooling. So that stuck with me. And there's a whole through line in the book about my passion around visionary schools and creating schools that were really meant to work for kids and so forth. So it came from there, and it stayed with me. Plus, I had an aunt who was a 40-year teacher. I suppose that rubbed off on me a bit too. So,
Hmm.
that's a whole different experience. One thing is the
Yeah.
vision for new schools. The other is running into school boards and bureaucracies and so forth. So,
Yeah, thinking more about that, I'm sure there's great to see a lot of the kids. So they work with a lot of different children. I'm sure we found some similarities and parallels between them and yourself as well.
right. But I think after teaching, I went to Stanford, and I TA'd and ROA'd and took classes from some of the best minds of the time, and I'm still in contact with some of them. And
That's right.
those ideas, those compelling ideas about leadership, just took hold, and I rode that
Mm,
horse for a long time.
wow. Let's transition into your book, The Lost Coin, a memoir of adoption and destiny. Tell us about this book? What's it about?
Well, it's about my lifelong search for my birth parents, and to
Mm,
be very brief about it, the first half of the book is actually tracking down my birth mother, and I did by the time I was age 40. Couple decades of struggling with bureaucracies and sealed records and so
mm-hmm,
forth. But I also got some breaks from a couple of people from my former adoption agency I found out my own name. I found out the name and hometown of my birth
mm,
mother. I went there. I found her picture in a class yearbook, 1944, and wrote people in the county with the same name. Said, "Do you know her? Where is she?" Weeks later, I got the name, and I wrote her to address back in the East
mm.
Coast. And eventually, by 1980, fall of '87, with my new half sister, I came knocking on her door. But as
Wow.
somebody warned me in doing that, remember, you won't find Elizabeth Taylor when you got there. What I found,
That's right.
what I knew coming, was that she was in state-sponsored housing. She had just come out of
Mm,
out of a halfway house, had huge problems with drugs and alcohol. But the upside of the whole story, when I did meet her, despite those horrible circumstances, is she let in her kitchen, told me about all the books that were in storage. She'd had 500 books, and that set light bulbs off in my head. then she pointed to a poster on the wall, and I said, "Oh, I say you've been to the National Gallery," and she goes, "Oh, of course, this is Kandinsky. This is the, then she launches into
Wow.
this art history lesson about Kandinsky's transition from Russia to Europe, rest of the Europe." And anyway, we had a moment or two that are it's a Kleenex jerker for sure, uh, where we really had this one-on-one. It was like a
Mm,
Spock mind meld. It was like she
wow.
opened up, I opened up, and the whole reason for coming there was known in an instant. That and having
Yeah.
her tell me that she did remember every time that my birthday came up. So, but that's a long
Oh,
story.
wow.
That part
Yeah.
was
And that's
detective
all in the
work.
book as well?
Oh
Yes.
yeah.
Well, I mean, you said so much so that we could have a whole, like, 5 shows about that. If I may ask, so did you know you were adopted when you were, I don't know, when you were given up for
Yes,
adoption, did you know you were
it was a
adopted?
condition. It was a condition of the adoption agency. So my mom and dad were told that they had to, and I think they were glad they did. And so no, I always knew that I was, and it
Mhm.
was always accompanied by the story that you're special,
Mm.
and that sort of set it apart. And it was never a question about their love for me, but at age 13, when I asked my mother, told her that I wanted to know more, and she was infuriated and said, "What's the matter? Don't you think we
Mm.
love you enough?" And
Oh,
from
yeah.
that moment on, it set me in motion for the rest of my life,
Yeah.
trying to
Yeah.
track them down. It was just one of those
Yeah.
things. It was just a burning passion.
Hmm. Yeah, I'm sure that was very difficult to hear that you're special. I mean, that's an interesting word choice to use. And I understand why they would use that word, but how did you interpret special?
Well, I don't know. I in the book I said, well, okay, I'm special. That's good. I think all kids ought to be told they're
Yeah.
special. But then I said in the book, well, what about the following brothers and sisters that they had that are younger than
Mm,
me, or weren't they special too? It's more of a rhetorical
hmm.
question. But
Yeah.
it does make there was a sense of being chosen, and I think
Yeah.
because of the circumstances of about not only my birth and the search, but everything in my life, it was sort of like this book became all how do I want to put this? It became it was sort of like Campbell's hero's return, hero's journey. I needed to bring this story back to other
Hmm.
adoptees who've gone through this, and
Hmm.
with my knowledge as a psychotherapist,
Yeah.
a much
Yeah.
deeper understanding of the experience of the adoptee. And even though I've had great success, great parents, there's still that primal
Correct.
wound.
Yeah.
I believe it's
Yeah. I'm
there.
sure. Being adopted, and I don't know if you have siblings, adopted or siblings in
No.
that family system. So to have your parents, your mom said, don't we love you enough? But to have that distance because you know you weren't their biological child, did you feel different? Did you felt that disconnect or that wall between them
Well,
as far as?
by the time I got to be in my teens, uh, it was more noticeable. I don't look like anybody in the
Mm,
family. Their
oh,
interests are all the same. Uh, I was much more social, into sports. Really, took to schooling. They were all smart. They've all college educated. My dad was a
mm,
surgeon, but they all like to go
mm,
hunting, camping, and fishing. And I just wasn't. Of course, it overlapped football season, so I wasn't going to do that. So we just were different in that way. We're still very close. We were all just
yeah,
together for a
yeah,
wedding in New York, but still, those differences, I think, as time went on, became more pronounced.
mm,
More in terms of the special destiny I seem to have because of my adoption,
mm,
more than the fact. I mean,
mm,
we definitely get along. We're a pretty tight family, but
yeah.
still, that it sets them apart. And having that now they've read the book, I don't think it's done anything to change that.
Yeah, I'm sure. Now, I'd like to generalize here. So, obviously, all people who are adopted don't have the same methodology or understanding of the world. But so if we can generalize it just for a second, most people who are adopted, and obviously you're the expert here, and as a personally and professionally,
Yeah.
where help us understand their identity. So, how do they How do they create their identity? How do they understand their place in the world?
It's a really big question. The "Who am I?" question, it runs through the
Hmm.
book. So we can find by things like, say, 23andMe and Ancestry.com. There's things we
Hmm.
can
Hmm.
find out factually about our backgrounds. And for a lot of people, just to find out that is enormous success. People who are frustrated to find out who they are, who their birth parents were, and so forth, either biologically or in a family tree. But the question begs, and this comes into being a depth psychologist in the Jungian tradition, begs a deeper dive into knowing your own interior life. Understanding the ways in which the unconscious can be has and continues to affect the past, whether it's from adoption or some other kind of trauma, or even from a parent that's long deceased, people still act as though we're trying to please that parent or whatnot. So that internal investigation and diving even deeper, and as I say in my book, the part of it, the deeper we go into the regions of the soul, let's say, it becomes less clear, becomes more mysterious. In fact, that's how my book ends, in using Zen koan to talk about the mysteries of life. And so I ended up in the book kind of, I think, quite, uh, how would I say, confident and pleased with the fact that some things we're not going to know. The questions
Mm,
themselves
sure.
engender search. So the idea of searching for this is actually sometimes more important than actually finding. So even after, in my case,
Mm,
even after I
yeah.
found my birth mother, and a couple of years ago, the identity of my birth father came to me, it still doesn't. For some people, that'd be bingo. That's end of story and a game. But for me, it becomes more compelling on that deeper level, almost existential. Who am I? And that comes, of
Yeah.
course, as you know, as a therapist, it comes up in the therapy room all the time in one way
Hmm.
or another, either directly or
Yeah.
it's hiding in plain sight a lot of times.
For individuals who are adopted or given up for adoption as well, how do they? When I say they, I don't mean in a pejorative way at all. I don't mean that in a negative way. For these individuals, how do they create relationships? Do they have secure attachments, insecure attachments? Excuse me, anxious attachments? What kind of styles
Well,
do they
I
have?
think generally, I mean, there's other factors in our development, including
Yeah, that's
but
fair.
beyond adoption, that can make for either solid bonding or
Hmm.
insecure
Hmm.
or ambivalent and so
Sure.
forth, or being totally neglected. So I would say that it's kind of always a bell curve. I mean, for some people,
Mm,
had adoption,
sure.
got new parents, happily bonded,
Hmm.
don't think twice about it, don't even want to hear there could be something unconscious. They don't
Hmm.
uh, particularly subscribe to the idea there's that inner wound. And for some, how do I know? Maybe it's not.
Yeah.
But I think
Yeah.
for others, I think I'm generalizing. I haven't taken a scientific survey that
Sure.
we carry that around. In my case, there were 4 months where I was given up at day 10 uh, for adoption, but I wasn't adopted until I was 6 months. So for 4 of those months, I was in a what was called a boarding home. I was with probably
Okay.
another woman or a couple who, I don't know if I was the only one there or other children there.
Hmm.
But that gap in time leaves great questions about what happens when you don't have that bonding. Does that make
Yeah.
somebody special?
That's
I don't
yeah, a
really know.
significant amount of time.
It remains, again, it remains a mystery.
Yeah. Hmm.
But I do think in
Hmm.
general, in fact, I've said that if the adoption community had a theme song, it'd be Dylan's "Like a Rolling Stone." How does it feel to be on your own, a
Yeah.
complete unknown, no direction
Yeah.
home, like a rolling stone? I mean, there's that kind of impetus. That and what Audrey Punnett, Jungian author, talks about as the orphan, either metaphoric or actually an archetype.
Hmm.
That inner
Hmm.
orphan. Now, if I don't use the word archetype, it sells better to people who are not familiar with
Yeah.
Jungian terminology.
Yeah.
But the
Of
idea of this
course.
restlessness, this I am like an orphan. I'm still wandering out there inside, maybe not
Hmm.
an outer life,
Hmm.
but that's why I think writing this book to kind of help expose that. I've always been very gratified. I'm not surprised, but gratified how many people resonate. Go, oh yeah, well that
Yeah.
accounts for that. And you see it in other.
Hmm.
You see it in like in Danny Shapiro, who wrote the book Inherit, a great book. She her she found out in later life that her father was actually a sperm donor that she tracked down very
Oh.
very quickly. But before that, she still calls out the fact of this sort of this not knowing, this inner restlessness, not knowing why. She had no reason to think that her father wasn't her father until at age 54 she found out that he wasn't, and
Oh
suddenly
gosh.
things made sense. So that's why I
Hmm.
say this: the effects in the conscious and kind of the sometimes they clank around behind us like Marley's ghost, sometimes without even knowing about
Hmm. Would you say this? Perhaps I don't know if you can speak to this as well. Would you say there's a difference between adoptive child who doesn't have siblings versus one who does have siblings? So not biological siblings, but brought into new family system.
it. You mean so? Say that again. A difference between.
Yeah. So you were adopted and you were the only child, and so is there a difference you think as far as the identity or acceptance or place in the world, if you will, your situation versus an adoptive child who now has siblings
Well, I did.
that
I
are in
did
the
have
home?
siblings. I have three siblings, but
Oh,
I have
I'm sorry. Oh, I
two, two,
misunderstood. Okay.
two other friends who came out of my high school class they were adopted and they were the
Mm.
only
Yeah.
child of their family. I would say it probably doesn't matter. I don't think if you're adopted
Mm.
or if you had siblings
Okay.
or not.
Okay.
Um, Maybe you have fewer people to compare yourself to. But it also really depends, I think, as you brought this up before, the degree to which your parents maybe you told you one time you were adopted and let it drop, or it's
Hmm.
part of the family narrative and becomes
Hmm.
your
Hmm.
narrative until you're old enough
Yeah.
to develop your own narrative. With or without siblings, I think that's uh, the impetus. I think, or the onus is really on the parent to keep that adoption story alive
Yeah. Yeah.
and realize that when you're a young adult, a young parent, you got an infant. Well, it is that's the adoption story. But as they get older, teenage and beyond, it has to own. It's the adoptee has to own that story, and then they have to. I think
Yeah.
this is where some of the healing comes in. You begin to change that narrative as you get older, and it begins to pick up more and different meaning that wasn't true when you were 13, as opposed to when you were
Mm. Yeah.
63 or whatever, 50
Yeah.
years down the road.
Yeah. I want to go back to the word, use the word special, because often, we see in the movies I'm not adopted. So, but you see in the movies, speaking to people like yourself, when they hear that, they often create the narrative as far as what was happening with their parents, create a whole storyline behind, or plot line rather, why they were given up for adoption. And in that, I mean, obviously trying to find one's identity. Is that something you did as well?
Well, let's see if I can answer this slightly differently. I think that what I learned as I got older, that which is true for a lot. In fact, it is true. A lot of times, a couple will have adopt a child and then have later their own children. There's a lot of that
Yeah,
stuff around.
sure.
But I think that the to now realize that the term special also meant special in their lives, because I think it was true with my parents and a couple other parents I know this is true for. They didn't think they could have children and were
Oh, okay.
probably up
That makes
against the wall
sense.
saying, this is not going to happen. And
Yeah,
suddenly,
yeah.
I know from my parents who were through other friends who adopted a girl a year older than me from the same, in fact, I'm named after that, the husband of that couple.
Mm,
Then things changed. And suddenly now you got a kid. And
mm,
although I don't think
yeah.
many knew I was adopted, certainly friends of my parents knew that I was. And that was a big deal because my dad was fairly prominent as a surgeon a
Hmm.
medium-sized town in Iowa. So I always had that feeling like, oh, here's little Stevie. He's the new kid,
Mm,
and
yeah,
it conferred something. I think almost unconsciously, in terms of saying being the chosen one means something. What, I don't know, but I think given the fate, other strokes of fate in my life, I think it was
hmm,
destined to, because of the adoption, destined to lead the life I've had. I mean, I've had a great career. I've had multiple careers,
hmm,
Stanford, on and on. And it's had some major downfall. There's also some other things in the book that show you how, when a different kind of trauma strikes in later life, in my case, losing my use of my leg athletically in high school after being a football star. Many years later, losing a big job in Silicon Valley as a superintendent in a
interesting.
huge public psychodrama. When those things hit, it's as though that past comes right back.
Yeah, I bet.
Abandonment, betrayal,
Hmm.
dissociation. You want to kind of crawl under either simultaneously want to crawl under the covers and also come out swinging. So, um, yeah, so that's I think those are the other kind of, you can see that in the arc of other people's lives. And when I see people
Mm, interesting.
in therapy, whether it's adoption or some other kind of early childhood trauma, you see how that complex, or you're spring loaded to overreact. Let's say, maybe not
Sure. Yeah.
overreact, but bound to have strong
Sure. Yeah.
reaction when you're up
Sure.
against the same kind of circumstances.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I appreciate you sharing that. I know that's very personal as well. With individuals who do have that experience, that trauma as a child, there's obviously always hope for them, for people who have trauma. But what are, in your book, do you talk about ways in which these people can overcome some of the trauma, so they don't have to repeat some of that trauma as life happens?
Yeah, well, for you mean, I'm going to pull this out because I had written this for something else and anticipating might be. I think one
Hmm.
of the things, if you're the parent of a child who's experienced this, and I'll say this could be
Yeah.
true for other kinds of trauma as well. Firstly, although parents always want to say they have unconditional love for their kids, but in truth, a lot of times they don't quite. Like, we'd love you just a
Yeah.
little bit more if you scored that extra goal, or your
Yeah.
SAT scores were just a little higher, or
Yeah.
you were a little bit nicer at the dinner table. We might love you a little bit more. So this idea of accepting a kid on their own terms, And your job, and we did this with our own son who we adopted at age 4, to see inside them and see, help call out their actual deepest essence and say, our job is to help let that bloom, whatever it goes, as opposed to, you're a bright kid. We want to make sure you have so we want to make sure you go to law school and become a pharmacist. In our case, our kid went into acting. So we wanted to support that. So that I think I think Orwell in 1984, there's a line that says, perhaps better to be seen than loved. And I think that's something that most adoptees would say, I don't want to become invisible. I want to be seen. So that's one thing.
Yeah.
As I mentioned before, the issue of having a parent support their child's curiosity, their own narrative, and if they do want to pursue a search for birth parents, encourage them and support them. If they don't, then you don't need to. And if and when they do connect, cannot see this somehow as a reflection on you, you the parent. It has to be, it's possible to have two mothers for different reasons. In my case, my mom growing up was always my mom. After I met my birth mother, I did not have a mom, but there was another woman who called me her son, and it's a special relationship altogether on a much deeper level. So that's a couple ways I would say. And I think also, it takes realizing for a kid growing up and wrestling with these things, it's really good every now and then to bring it up, not to force it on them, but to bring up and acknowledge or a story or memory you have. And of course, the problem with adoptees is that sometimes betrayal on those facts of your past life are scarce or non-existent. Sealed records, not always. And I think also occasionally, sometimes as people get older, there's sometimes you're not supposed to find that person. They don't want to be found.
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah,
I've got a client who
that's a hard one to swallow.
Was adopted out of South America and found that his birth mother and probably birth father were very closely connected to a major drug cartel in South America. They probably don't want to be found.
You probably don't want to find for your safety. Yeah. I really appreciate your expertise today. I mean, we could definitely talk so much more about this, but unfortunately our time is up. So if my viewers and listeners, Dr. Stephen Rowley, want to find out more information about you and to purchase your book, The Lost Coin, A Memoir of Adoption and Destiny, where will they find all this information online? Well, my website has, of course, they can find the book on Amazon, but my website is my name, Stephen Rowley, StephenRowley, 108.com. And there's a whole section in that book about the memoir, and your podcast will be on there in time, and a few other articles on adoption and identity that are in there. So I think it's a good resource for people. Well, wonderful. I really do appreciate your expertise. I mean, this is something, obviously, you personally know and professionally know it, and so it's good to be able to share that with the world as well. And viewers and listeners also know that if they can't find this information any other place, simply go to the show notes at jamesmillerlifeology.com and I'll link with Dr. Stephen Rowley and his book, The Lost Coin, a memoir of adoption and destiny. Thank you so much. Once again, I really do appreciate it. Thanks, James. Appreciate it. Thank you.